Hi everybody. As usual, the books I'm going to be talking about will be time-stamped in the description below. The Sword of the Lictor by Jane Wolfe is book 3 in Book of the New Sun, and this is by far my favorite Book of the New Sun book so far. In this journey, we are following a character named Severian in first-person narration. In book 1, we find he is being raised in a torturer's guild. He ends up acquiring a sword called Terminus Est, as well as another item along the way. And he ends up on this epic adventure. And we also learn from him telling his tale that he apparently has an infallible memory. One of the things I'm loving about this series so far is the way that we're playing with time, especially as this is set in the distant future, but it seems to also have connections to the past. And there are also just some interesting, trippy things happening with time, the way it's played with in the series. Now, this book is my favorite in the series so far because, as I mentioned, we are on this epic quest, and there are certainly some gorgeous, rich descriptions of setting, including beginning at a walled fortress city, going through cliffside and jungle and forest and mountaintop, and ending up at a castle alongside a lake. But the other reason that I love this particular installment is not only is the journey arduous, I mean, it is physically taxing, but I felt like there were several emotional moments. There were interesting ebbs and flows with emotion, including grief and experiencing loss and connection and anger, humiliation. I felt like there were a range of emotions. That said, this is a story that does not linger on one thing very long. So even though we get these beautiful reflective passages or even stunning descriptions of setting, we're quickly off to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, as is I think typical for certain types of fantasy. I want to say sword and sorcery, as well as maybe Jack Vance, who I've only read one tale from before, but it feels along that type of journey. The other thing is that this is littered with symbolism, and it certainly has a lot of cryptic passages and conversations. Now, I am not the smartest person to be reading Wolfe's prose by any means, and I think I have a higher tolerance for confusion than most readers, but I love seeing how certain symbols or certain things might be connecting and hearkening back to things that happened in book 1. So this has been such an incredible journey for me so far, and I've been having a fantastic time buddy reading this with my friend Jake from Nerd Level Rising. We're part of a larger read-along group, but we decided that we wanted to talk through our experiences by reading a chapter a day and talking about it. So we were reading a chapter a day. We did that for book 2 as well, The Claw of the Conciliator. But for this, we decided to bump it up to 2 chapters a day. And for me personally, I found that very helpful because while there's plenty to unpack in Wolfe's prose in a single chapter, I felt like I was getting more of the larger story elements, like it was coming together for me a little bit more reading 2 chapters a day. But this has been a fantastic journey. I do need to say, though, that the male gaze and wish fulfillment is off the charts. I know I've mentioned that before in previous videos, but it's worth mentioning again. It's to the point where I find it kind of laughable at times. But as I said, because we're not staying in one place for very long, it doesn't linger on those moments too heavily. So, you know, it's a thing. It might bother some readers. It might not bother others. But the things that I am loving in this series are what's keeping me glued to the page, and I'm so excited to see where things go. Only the Mockingbird Sings at the Edge of the Woods. Mockingbird by Walter Tevis is a post-apocalyptic novel that was published in 1980. And this is a story that takes place in the distant future, and at this time, human beings have toked up and checked out. They're basically smoking weed, taking pills, numbing out, and letting robots do all the heavy lifting. Sound familiar? As we are constantly having conversations these days about the power of AI and how that might be taking over certain jobs and doing a lot of advanced things too. I think it's a relevant book to explore. What's interesting about this story is that we're following 3 perspectives. We're following the perspective of a robot. He is cloned after a black man, and he is programmed in order to live despite his wishes and to feel emotions. And so this is a difficult combination for him. And the irony here is that he seems more deeply human than the human characters in this story. So we also follow a man and a woman, and I couldn't help but feel like there was a certain Adam and Eve symbolism sprinkled throughout. They end up deciding to rebel against the current ways of life, or wanting something different for themselves than what society is giving them, because the man, the male character, he ends up almost by accident, teaching himself how to read, because guess what? Humanity doesn't read at this time. Literature is no longer a thing. And then he meets a woman who happens to not partake of the drugs that everybody else takes at this time. And as a result, she also wants to memorize her life. And so these two come together and they start to realize certain things. They start to notice certain things because as people are numbing out with drugs and not reading or engaging with their lives in a meaningful way, they're not noticing certain things. But this man and woman do. They notice that children don't exist, that people don't talk to each other. And they also notice that there are groups of 3 people that are dying by suicide regularly. So I really like this thought experiment because I do wonder if in the future, if technology gets so advanced, especially with artificial intelligence technology, that we no longer have to work anymore and we can live lives of leisure. But not only that, we don't have music mean the same thing anymore or literature mean the same thing if a computer can generate it. Are we going to lose a sense of purpose, or are we going to still seek for that connection that's only purely human somehow? You know, maybe going to live concerts, that hopefully will still be a thing in the future. But it is a question that we can ask. What happens when your purpose and meaning in your life is robbed from you without you even realizing it, because the situation becomes repressed in that sense. And the people in the society in the future, they're told slogans such as quick sex is best and don't ask, relax. The idea is that you don't critically examine your situation. You're not introspective. And even the pleasures that you do achieve in life, they are quick-lived. They're mostly about numbing out. It's not a real way to live. And so I just appreciated the exploration here. There are certainly things to criticize in this book. There were a couple of things that I don't know, that I found a little odd, but I did appreciate the story overall. In addition to the Adam and Eve symbolism I mentioned before, I noticed a quick allusion to a Robert Frost poem. And so it makes me think there were probably several other allusions throughout that I might have missed, but I thought this was worth reading and worth thinking about, and I'm glad I got to this. I picked this up because it was Jimmy from the Fantasy Network's Patreon pick of the month, and this was selected for him from Bridger from the Library Ladder. And I was impressed with the selection because I felt like Bridger considered Jimmy's taste in books and what he's interested in right now, given that Jimmy has expressed interest in shorter books, post-apocalyptic fiction, and books that maybe lean a little bit more literary. Also worth noting about Mockingbird, it does explore literacy and it has a critique of religion. I think it has a couple of different views regarding that. And it's not a mind-blowing science fiction read by any means, but it is thought-provoking. And if you enjoy post-apocalyptic stories that explore the rise of technology and how that affects humanity and culture and connection and intimacy, then it might be worth picking up. The Talisman by Peter Straub and Stephen King is a portal fantasy story, and I want to say it's a standalone because it functions as a standalone, though there is a sequel, and I believe a 3rd book coming out soon, though Peter Straub is no longer with us. This is a chunky book. This is following a 12-year-old boy whose mother is dying of cancer, and in order to save her, he makes a journey across the US as well as into a portal fantasy world called the Territories, and he's going there to seek a magical talisman that is supposed to save his mother in both worlds, because there happen to be twins. People who exist in one world have a twin in the fantasy world. And the fantasy world, it has some medieval touches. It also, I felt like, had some nods to Tolkien. Tolkien's referenced in this story a couple of times. And I think one of the charming things about this story is a character that Jack comes across named Wolfe. And then later on, he ends up with another friend character that I did not enjoy reading about. I found that character quite whiny and annoying. I think, like a lot of other King books, I found that the real world horror parts were more unsettling at times than the fantastical ones. And I could tell there was a lot of effort put into this portal fantasy world in terms of making it connect to our real world. And it also connects to the Dark Tower series, if you're a fan of that. But at the same time, I just didn't quite find it very inspired. And I found that the villains in this story were a bit lackluster for me. And while there were a couple of moments where I felt there was a good amount of tension on the page, I felt like when I looked at the story as a whole, it felt as though there was a lot of effort to put the character in a lot of vulnerable situations, or that there was danger lurking around every corner. But I think because of that, because it was so full of danger the whole entire time for this chosen one story, I failed to feel the tension. And in fact, I kept feeling like every time we changed settings, I found myself getting a little more interested in the story and thinking, "Oh, this is interesting," and then find it dragged for me a bit. Now, I usually resist ever saying the word bloated, that a story is bloated. I've said it about one other book I've read, and I think I'm going to say it about this one. For me, personally, I found this book bloated. That's a subjective thing. I know people who love The Talisman. In fact, my brother loves it. He gifted me the book, which is why I wanted to get to it. But for me, it just didn't feel very inspiring. And there were great moments, but not enough payoff for me personally. And I also want to say that Jack's mother, being the person who all the stakes resided upon, was barely in the story. And when she was in the story, I think those were some more interesting parts. Those are just my personal thoughts. It wasn't the worst read in the world. There were certainly moments that kept me engaged, but it just didn't quite leave a mark on me. A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro is my fourth Ishiguro novel, and this is his debut novel. It was published in 1982. I noticed that I read all 80s books this last month. I have such high praise for this book, but before I go into my list of superlatives and talk about all the similar things I've said about Ishiguro in the past, I thought I would illustrate exactly how Ishiguro says so much with precise language by sharing the first page and a half. And you could skip this part if it's not of interest to you, and you can add your thoughts too below of what you're noticing in this text if you'd be so inclined. Nikki, the name we gave my younger daughter, is not an abbreviation. It was a compromise I reached with her father, for paradoxically it was he who wanted to give her a Japanese name, and I, perhaps out of some selfish desire not to be reminded of the past, insisted on an English one. He finally agreed to Nikki, thinking it had some vague echo of the East about it. So right away, we're able to infer certain points of information. We learn that there are two daughters, as Nikki is the younger daughter. And we learn that while our narrator, the mother, is Japanese, the husband likely isn't. Yet, she, the narrator, feels some ambivalence about her Japanese past. There's even more that we could be curious about, such as the dynamic between the husband and the wife. But going on to the next paragraph here, she came to see me earlier this year in April, when the days were still cold and drizzly. Perhaps she had intended to stay longer, I do not know. But my country house and the quiet that surrounds it made her restless, and before long I could see she was anxious to return to her life in London. She listened impatiently to my classical records, flicked through numerous magazines. The telephone rang for her regularly, and she would stride across the carpet, her thin figure squeezed into her tight clothes, taking care to close the door behind so I would not overhear her conversation. She left after 5 days. So from here, we learned that Nikki is living in London. She's visiting her mother at a country home, and that this is possibly causing her to feel quite a bit restless as her lifestyle is a little more fast-paced. She has a social life. She enjoys different types of music, and there is a restless energy going on here. But as we read on, we learn that there's certain anxiety regarding Nikki's sister. Something has clearly happened to Nikki's sister. She discusses how she and her sister were never close, as she feels sisters should be, and that she doesn't have the fondest memories of her sister. And then in the last couple of paragraphs of this section, we learn that this anxiety, this restlessness, has to do with Nikki's half-sister Keiko having died by suicide. And we also learn that Keiko, unlike Nikki, was pure Japanese. So in short, to talk about what we're dealing with here, we're following a character named Etsuko, and Etsuko is reflecting on two timelines. She's talking about these 5 days in which her daughter Nikki is visiting her from London, just following the death of her other daughter. And then we are flipping to a past timeline when Etsuko is first pregnant, and she's living in Nagasaki just after the atomic bomb, when people are trying to cope and rebuild their lives and trying to look ahead for some type of optimism. And we're also exploring whether for women, especially during that time in Japan, whether all optimism is solely based on your children, or whether there is something else to aspire for in life. This is also contrasted with the present timeline and Nikki representing a modern English ideal. The timelines go back and forth, like I said, throughout the book, and we're getting different conversations, but they all seem to be connected towards that theme. I think we could also sum this up in a broader way to say tradition versus progress. And there are also conversations in this story with Japanese men just past that bombing in Nagasaki, and conversation about the older generational view of Japanese traditions and education and punishment and some of the horrors that have happened there versus other generations or younger generations who have a different vision for the future. I was deeply pulled into Etsuko's story with the various conversations that happen between her and a variety of characters in Nagasaki, and then also with this timeline in the present with her daughter Nikki, and how those two things were in contrast with one another and how there were connections between the two thematically. But when I got to the end of the story, I finished the last page and my first thought was, what's going on here? Why is this over? And then I thought about it more. And suddenly I started to see the story in a different way. And I was buddy reading this with Murphy. I've been buddy reading Ishiguro books with Murphy and Jimmy as well, but Jimmy had already read this book. And I shared my thoughts with her, and then she shared with me another insight that it pointed to something that could easily be overlooked, and I didn't quite look at it as carefully as she did, but it also brought in a whole other layer to the story. As my jaw is dropping, I clearly can't go into spoilers here, but I will say this is a quiet story. This is not a loud, bombastic, plot twisty type of story. I guarantee people are going to read this. Many people will read this and think, what's the big deal? I tried to look at it from a distance and see how I can critique this story, because I know it might not be to everyone's taste, but for me, I feel like everything felt purposeful. Everything felt like it was there to build to something, to build to what the themes were. So that's where I'll leave it for now. But I am such a fan of Ishiguro. I don't have any authors that I would call auto by authors. I know that's a common type of video on YouTube or on BookTube, is to say, these are my auto by authors. I don't have any authors like that. I can't think of a single author who has works that I love and adore that I feel like I necessarily need to read every book from, but I want to read every book that Ishiguro has written because I'm in awe. I'm in awe of what he does. And another thing I can quickly say is that I think that with every book I've read, I'm impressed with the way he writes first-person narration, because I always feel like his characters have already broken the ice with me. Like we've already met each other, we've started talking, and we're in the middle of already in our ease of conversation when they start telling me their story. That's what it feels like. But at the same time, his characters they are always hiding something. They're always hiding while they reveal. And I don't know, it's so powerful to go through that journey with his stories and with his characters. And that is it for the books I read in the month of September. If I had to pick a favorite, it would be A Pale View of Hills by Ishiguro and The Sword of the Lictor by Gene Wolfe. It has to be both. It has to be. I loved Cryptic and Crazy, and I loved quiet, in-depth, meaningful, soul-crushing, and both have very different styles of prose, but both are just so perfectly told, in my opinion. Both pulled me in. So what a phenomenal month, considering I read both this last month. And I'll go ahead and quickly say some other things. I was a guest on my friend Nico's channel for his first ever game show, Prose Lyric Verse, and that is where he would show certain quotes on the screen, and you have to guess, is the quote from a song? Is it from poetry, or is it from a book? And then if you get that right, you get a certain amount of points. And then if you can guess the source, then you get extra points. You could even watch the replay and play yourself if you wanted to, but I played against Philip Chase, and I won't give away who won, but it was so much fun. So please check it out and then find out for yourself who won. And then speaking of Philip Chase, I was a guest on Dear Dr. Fantasy, a return guest, I should say, because I was guest number 2 back in the day, but that was before the standard question, and it was before Philip made the fun, campy thumbnails. So I finally got a fun, campy Dear Dr. Fantasy thumbnail. They're the best thumbnails on BookTube by far. And so it was such a wonderful time. We got into literacy and how it's taught in the US. And I loved hearing Philip's thoughts about this because it's a topic I've been really curious about. So I was able to ask him questions about that. And we also talked about reading critically. We talked about different types of authors and various other topics. And then I also had a wonderful Why Read episode just recently here on my channel. And that was with Nikhil from Shelf Esteemed and Sylvia from Library Unbounded, two wonderful people. And it was a delightful episode. I need to mention here that I was a guest on Bart's channel. That's Bart from Bart's Book Space, and we had a wonderful time talking about science fiction. So please go check that out and go check out Bart's channel. He has fantastic science fiction content. And then aside from that, I was also a guest on my friend Josh's channel from Red Fury Books. I was on his Books and Brunch discussion series, and that was with Jimmy from the Fantasy Network. And we had a fabulous time. I actually gave a little pre-review of A Pale View of Hills there that was mostly in shocks and sounds and gasps, or shocked expressions, I should say. But it was a wonderful time. I had a great time with both of them there. And then later that same day, I joined my friend Matt on Books at the pub on Sunday at the Pub, which is his series, his live show series on Sundays. And so that was fabulous. Josh from Red Fairy Books, by the way, Matt on Books and I share a Discord. We co-own a Discord together called The Fireside. And our friend Evie from She Was Only Evie is a mod for that Discord. And we started a book club. The first book that we did a discussion about was one I chose. It won the vote, and that was Blindsight by Peter Watts. I reviewed that back in my August wrap-up if you're curious. And unfortunately, most people didn't like it as much as I did. And then I happened to win for the next pick, which is The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. So we'll be reading that probably within the next month. So if you want to check that out and join in the chat whenever we have a discussion, please do so. So that is it for me from now. Please let me know in the comment section below if you've read any of the books I've mentioned, if you're planning to read any of the books I've mentioned. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you all so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.